The Chevy Vega may have been named after a star, but the reality is it burned out pretty quickly. But for one brief shining moment, the Vega name was attached to something really spectacular, the Cosworth Vega. Hi there, Rick DeBrule once again back at the Martin Auto Museum here in Phoenix, a great collection of more than 170 cars, each one with a different story about the automotive evolution. Some long and, well, relatively simple, some short and very complex. And that is exactly the story of this car right here, a 1975 Cosworth Vega with that twin cam engine underneath the hood. Before we talk about the car though, don't forget to like and subscribe, and in the comments below and let me know what I got right and what I got wrong. Now, let's talk about this car. It's actually one of my favorite cars from the 1970s. And let's talk about the fact that if you wanted to drive Formula One technology on the street back then in the 70s, you could buy yourself a really expensive Ferrari, or you could get a Cosworth Vega. What does Cosworth mean? Well, Cosworth was an engine company. They started back in 1958. They started building racing engines for some of the smaller formulas, then worked their way up to Formula One. And people today don't realize it, but Cosworth is third on the all-time Formula One list for engines, behind only Ferrari and Mercedes. Cosworth is one of the best engine builders of all time. In fact, that company still exists today doing engine and engineering work. Now, let's go back to the late 60s. That's when the story of the Vega really begins. Well, that's when Chevrolet started working on the concept of the Vega. It officially debuted as a 1971 model. You know, it was Chevy's answer to the growing demand for smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles during that era. Ads back then touted it as inexpensive but not cheap. You know, it was the kind of car that would grow on you, and it seemed great right out of the gate. In fact, the Vega was initially praised for its modern design, and in 1971, it won the Motor Trend Car of the Year award. Now, sales ultimately peaked in 1974 with 460,000 cars sold. That is a huge number, but the Vega's reputation quickly got pretty crusty because it had a whole series of quality and reliability issues, including problems with its aluminum block and rust underneath the car. At one point, there were recalls in effect for 6 out of every 7 Vegas in the United States. As happens so often during the production run, many of the problems ultimately were fixed or improved. Unfortunately, the Vega's reputation had been tarnished early on. So it was pretty much downhill after that. In fact, the very last year, 1977, only 78,000 Vegas were sold. Now, John DeLorean had joined as the head of Chevrolet after the car was conceived, but before it hit the streets. And right off the bat, he said, you know, we need a higher performance version of the Vega. Now, they had the GT, but he wanted something even more. So they decided to get together with the Cosworth folks. Now, interestingly enough, Cosworth had been more closely associated with Ford back in those days, and Jim thought, well, let's kind of muscle in on some of that. But it wasn't just the engine that was so special, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. It was also the paint scheme for this car. This black and gold, you got to remember, this was the color that was seen on 2 Formula One champions during the 1970s. Mario Andretti in 1978 and Emerson Fittipaldi winning the championship with a Cosworth engine in 1972. This black and gold, originally called the John Player Special Colors, this was very iconic in its day. So it had the Cosworth name, the Cosworth engine. It had this iconic coloring, this black and gold. It seemed like it was going to be an absolute hit from day one. But a lot of problems cropped up that slowed down the ability for this car to make a big dent in the sales world. As I mentioned, the Vega name came from a star that's in the Lyra constellation, one of the brightest stars in the sky, or at least in the constellation itself. I've heard some astronomers use the name Vega. We refer to it as Vega, of course, for this particular car. In 1971, when they first came out with this car, they had a much flatter front to it. And to be honest with you, I actually like the styling on that. Very similar to the look of the Camaro back in its day, with the headlights right here and the flatter styling right there. In 1973, they had to extend it out just a little bit. And this is the 1975 version. See how it goes all the way down to this 5-mile-an-hour bumper right here. The slope, I don't think, is quite as attractive as it was in the early days. Now, I mentioned, of course, that you got this black and gold look. You also got gold-styled wheels, and, of course, the pinstriping that was gold and the Cosworth twin cam name. When you were buying the Vega back in those days, if you got just a regular Vega, you had your choice of a fastback, you had the notchback, you could get a sedan delivery, or you could get a station wagon. The sedan delivery, of course, just had a panel in the back where the windows would have gone. So it had a little more styling. When you came to buying the Cosworth Vega, however, you were limited to just getting one particular look, and that's this hatchback look that we get right here. All right, let's take a look at the star of the show up here in the engine compartment, this Cosworth twin cam engine. This engine that was 2 liters, 122 cubic inches, and put out 110 horsepower. The significance of that is that the base Vega engine that all the other folks were getting was just producing 78 horsepower. And you got to remember, this was the mid-70s, not a lot of horsepower going out at that point in time. Before we talk about the twin cams up on top, I do want to talk about the engine block down below and the significance of that. First off, it was made from aluminum. In fact, when they originally did the proposals for the Vega engine in this aluminum block, they were also proposing the idea that they could go without a radiator. They thought this aluminum engine would dissipate the heat so well that they weren't even going to need a radiator. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. This has a radiator. As we've learned as time's gone along, just because it's aluminum doesn't mean you can get away with that. So one of the things that was interesting was they didn't just take an engine that Cosworth had. They actually took the aluminum block that the Vegas were using, that Chevrolet had making, they sent it over to Cosworth, and Cosworth reworked it. Now, as I mentioned, there was a 78 horsepower version of this, and that was a 2.3 liter engine. That was a total of about 140 cubic inches. And what they did at Cosworth, 2 things that were really important. Number one, they downsized it. They took it down to 2 liters, just 122 cubic inches. And they did that for 2 very important reasons. The first was it made it a little stronger, a little better to work with. And that was a reliability thing that they had to deal with the Vega engines back in those days. They weren't that reliable. But by reducing it, they could make it a little bit stronger. The other thing they wanted to do was to make a 2-liter racing engines. 2-liter classes were really big around the world. And the idea of having a 2-liter engine that you could then use in other purposes, in other racing endeavors, made sense. Unfortunately, that also never quite happened. The significance, though, on top is the fact that it has what's called a dual overhead cam engine. This dual overhead cam, meaning there's 2 camshafts, allowed it to have 4 valves per cylinder. Now, as time's gone along, we figured out ways to have single overhead cams that have 4 valves per cylinder. But back then, this was the most efficient and most effective way to do that. Of course, it was a little heavier, a little more complex in some ways, but it was the way to allow for more valves per cylinder. The importance of that is 4 valves allows 2 intake valves, more air coming in, 2 exhaust valves, quicker air going out, which increased the horsepower. Now, when they first started doing the prototype work on this engine, they were getting between 260 and 290 horsepower out of that 2-liter engine. It was exactly what John DeLorean was dreaming of when they first implemented this idea for this program. Unfortunately, a couple things of significance were happening at that same point in time. Fuel mileage was becoming very important. They needed to get better mileage, and emissions were coming into play. They needed cleaner engines. And back then, the ways that they solved those problems also reduced the power coming out of the engines. One of the things that was really significant that they had to do was they had to reduce the compression from 12 to 1 down to 8.5 to 1. Now, 12 to 1 is where you take all the air that's in that piston and you reduce it down in just a little tiny space. 8 to 1, not quite as much. And with that 12 to 1, that's where you get that big bounce back and you get even more power coming out of it. Unfortunately, with 8.5 to 1, instead of getting more than 200 horsepower, they were only able to get 110 horsepower out of this. Still pretty impressive. I mean, in its day, they were doing 7.7 seconds in a 0 to 60 time, but still not as spectacular as they were hoping for. By the way, one interesting thing about this engine is they were using Bendix fuel injection. It was electronic fuel injection. This is the first time that we see electronic fuel injection in a General Motors car. When they originally ordered these engines from Cosworth, they actually ordered 5,000 of them. They had a big plan. They thought they were sure that they were going to be able to use 5,000 of these engines. Unfortunately, the ultimate run for these cars was only about 3,500. As a result, there were like almost 1,500 engines that never got put into cars. Ultimately, a lot of them were, cannibalized for various parts, and then the rest of them were just scrapped. Hard to believe that these engines, which are so important in its day and so really interesting for Formula One technology into a street car, 1,500 of them, almost a third of them, just got scrapped. The Vega didn't have a lot of horsepower back in the beginning, but one of the things it did have was great handling. In fact, the handling package, the suspension, everything, the way it had been put together was one of the things that a lot of the writers in the magazines praised a lot back in the 70s when this car first came out in 1971. In fact, you could say that's one of the main reasons that got that Motor Trend Car of the Year award. It was built on a 97-inch wheelbase. The overall length increased as time went along. Now, I mentioned the fact that they had increased the length of this car because in 1973, they had to stretch it out 3 inches to meet up with those bumpers. And in 1974, it went out a total of almost 6 inches because of that front end going down to that bumper. So it was a much longer car. A little bit more weight up front, which probably impacted the handling just a little bit. But overall, the package on this car was pretty good. Now, when they made the Cosworth twin cam version of this, they also increased the ability of the suspension. They stiffened some of the springs, did a few things. Not a massive change, but just enough to make it a slightly better handling car. For the most part, what you really got with a Cosworth Vega on the inside was a Vega interior. But there were some things they did to make this car special. The first thing you would notice right off the bat when you got in was this gold look dashboard, the plate right across the front of you with the engine turned look. Pretty cool, obviously, to kind of work with that black and gold styling. You also got a little plaque here that said Cosworth Vega, 16 valve engine, dual overhead cam, and it gave you the number for your particular car. 1582 in this case. You also got this neat little Cosworth Vega emblem right there. Once again, not an awful lot, but when you think about it, the fact that you had this black on the inside, the gold look, it kind of worked to copy what was on the outside. And I should point out that most of the cars sold in 1975 had this black interior, but there were about 16% that got a white interior. So it wasn't the only interior you could get for 1975, but this black and gold in this particular style, I think works very, very well. You also, of course, got this 4-speed transmission, which was pretty cool. Now, in 1976, they started offering more colors both on the outside and the inside. In fact, I think there were a total of 8 colors that were offered for 1976. So they started to expand a little bit, but most of the cars that were sold, most of the Cosworth Vegas, have this classic John Player special look, the black and the gold pinstriping on the outside as well. By the way, the back seat in this isn't bad at all. I was looking at it. You know, it's, to be honest with you, I think better than some of the Mustangs and some of the Camaros that you come out with today. But you have to remember, this was designed to be an economy car for somebody who, needed maybe to put kids in the back seat. There's just enough room in the back for legs to hang down. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's comfortable back there, but in terms of a back seat, it's actually not bad, all things considered. John DeLorean had taken over as the head of Chevrolet just before the Vega came out. And one of the things he was responsible for was creating a quality control program for the Vega in particular. The idea was to make sure that it was in even better condition when it rolled off the factory floor than a lot of the cars that had come before it. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it wasn't enough. There were so many build problems associated with this car that there were a large number of recalls. In many ways, they had rushed this into production, and unfortunately, a lot of those engineering issues came back to haunt the Vega. The Cosworth Vega has a strong fan club today, but not quite so much back in 1975 and 1976. Just had a 2-year run. They originally had plans, as I mentioned, to build about 5,000 of those. That's how many engines were built, but they never achieved that goal. The first year, they built just over 2,000 of them. The second year, they sold less than 1,500. The final result was just around 3,500 over the course of the 2 years that they built the Cosworth Vega in 1975. In 1976. They really had 2 problems. The first was, well, it was a Vega. And while the Vega ultimately sold more than 2 million cars during its 7-year run, the bulk of that came during the first half, as those problems that they had, recalls, all kinds of issues with rust and the engines, as those began to accumulate, the Vega began to lose popularity. And in fact, by 75, 76, and 77, it was very unpopular in its day. In fact, I think I might have mentioned they only sold 78,000 of these in the final year in 1977. So the Vega was a bit of a problem, and being tied to that car, that absolutely did not help. But the other problem with this car was the original goal was to sell it for around $4,000. When it was finally on the showroom floor, the actual cost was closer to $6,000. $6,000. That was almost twice what a regular Vega was going to cost. And when you compare it to some other cars, for example, if you were to buy a 1975 Corvette, if you got the convertible version, I think that was only going to cost you like $600 more. Think about that. For $600 more, you could get a convertible Corvette instead of this car. And if you just wanted, well, let's just say a Camaro, like the LT version, which was the nicer version, that was only going to cost you $4,000 for a base car. A Trans Am, well, that was like $4,750. So the nearly $6,000 you were spending for this car, to be honest with you, was pretty expensive in its day, and it didn't quite have enough performance and, more importantly, enough panache and style to warrant that. Yeah, it had a hand-built engine that was really something that was, had Formula One technology that you could drive on the street. But that was just the engine. The rest of the car was just a Vega, and the Vega was an economy car. So someone who was going to be spending $6,000 and saying, wait a minute, yeah, I got a cool paint job, I got a cool engine, but it's still a Vega, when for only $600 more, I could move myself into at least the base version of the Corvette. I think a lot of people decided that really wasn't what they wanted to do. Yes, it handled well. It had that 53% of the weight on the front end, 47 on the back. I think the people who were doing the road testing back in those days, they really admired this car a lot. Yeah, it had its flaws, but for a car that came out of the Vega, it wasn't too bad. But once again, 2-year run, only 1975 and 1976, and when it was gone because the Vega came to an end in 1977. But this car, this Cosworth Vega from 1975 with this black and gold pinstriping, boy, what a really cool car, and what an interesting short chapter in the automotive evolution.